The leather-bound journal fell from my trembling hands, landing with a soft thud on the dusty attic floor. The words I'd just read couldn't be real. They couldn't be true. But there they were, written in careful cursive across pages yellowed with age. Today marks 1 year since I faked my own death. David still has no idea his aunt is alive. My husband's Aunt Catherine, the woman whose funeral I'd attended just 8 months ago, whose estate we'd inherited, whose tragic death from cancer had supposedly devastated the family, was alive when she wrote these words. Not only alive, but deliberately hiding from us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Saturday in our new home in Millbrook, Vermont. David was at his weekend job at the hardware store, and I'd finally found the motivation to tackle the overwhelming task of cleaning out Aunt Catherine's attic. The Victorian house on Maple Street had been in the Whitmore family for generations, and when Catherine passed away last spring, David inherited everything. We'd moved in 2 months ago, but the third floor remained untouched, filled with decades of accumulated memories and forgotten treasures. I'd been putting off this particular chore for weeks. Something about going through a dead woman's belongings felt invasive, even though she was technically family. Catherine had been David's father's sister, a spinster who'd never married after her fiancé Harold died in Vietnam. Or so the family story went. She'd lived alone in this sprawling house for 30 years, keeping to herself, rarely attending family gatherings. When breast cancer took her at 68, David had been genuinely devastated. He'd always spoken fondly of her quiet wisdom and generous spirit. The attic was a maze of cardboard boxes, old furniture draped in white sheets, and steamer trunks that looked like they hadn't been opened since the 1940s. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight streaming through the small windows, and the air held that particular mustiness that comes from decades of undisturbed storage. I'd armed myself with garbage bags, cleaning supplies, and a thermos of coffee, determined to make a significant dent in the chaos. Most of what I found was exactly what you'd expect from an elderly woman's attic. Boxes of Christmas decorations from multiple decades, each style reflecting the trends of its time. Photo albums filled with black and white pictures of stern-faced relatives I didn't recognize. Clothes that smelled of mothballs and memories. I'd been working for about 3 hours when I discovered the trunk. It was different from the others, smaller and more ornate, with brass corners that had somehow maintained their shine despite the dusty environment. Unlike the other containers that were stacked haphazardly around the attic, this one was positioned carefully in the far corner, almost hidden behind a collection of old mirrors. When I lifted the lid, I expected to find more photographs or perhaps some jewelry. Instead, I found a collection of journals. There were at least a dozen of them, all bound in similar leather covers but clearly from different time periods. Some were thick and well-worn, their pages soft with frequent handling. Others appeared barely used, as if they'd been started with good intentions but quickly abandoned. I picked up the one that seemed most recent, noting that it felt heavier than the others, more substantial. The first entry was dated 3 years ago, written in the same careful handwriting I remembered seeing on Catherine's occasional Christmas cards. But as I began to read, my understanding of everything I thought I knew about David's aunt began to crumble. March 15th. I've made the decision. After 30 years of hiding, 30 years of letting Harold control every aspect of my life through fear and manipulation, I'm going to disappear completely. The cancer diagnosis gives me the perfect opportunity. Everyone expects me to die anyway. I had to read that paragraph 3 times before the words made sense. Harold was supposed to be dead. Harold was the fiancé who died in Vietnam before they could marry. The tragic loss that had supposedly shaped Catherine into the reclusive spinster the family knew. But this entry suggested not only that Harold was alive, but that Catherine had been living with him in some kind of abusive situation for 3 decades. My hands shook as I turned the page, desperate to understand what I was reading. Harold's threats have become more frequent lately. Last week, he told me again that if I ever tried to leave, he'd make sure my family knew exactly what kind of person I really was. He has photos, he says. Documents. Evidence of things I was forced to do in the early days when I was too scared and too isolated to fight back. The shame of it has kept me trapped all these years. But I'm 65 now. If I don't act soon, I'll die in this prison he's created. I sat back on my heels, trying to process what I was reading. This wasn't the gentle, solitary woman David had described. This was someone who'd been living in terror, someone who'd been systematically abused and blackmailed for decades, and somehow she'd managed to keep it hidden from everyone who supposedly cared about her. The next several entries detailed Catherine's careful planning. She'd been documenting Harold's abuse for months, building a case she hoped would protect her if she ever found the courage to leave. But more disturbing were her observations about her own family's behavior. David called today, asking again about the house and whether I'd updated my will recently. It was the third time this month. He's never shown much interest in my welfare before, but lately his conversations always seem to circle back to financial matters. When I mentioned that I might need to hire a home health aide soon, he actually seemed annoyed by the expense. My stomach clenched as I read those words. I remembered David mentioning those phone calls to his aunt, but he'd presented them as concerned check-ins with an elderly relative. The way Catherine described them painted a very different picture. Marcus stopped by yesterday with papers for me to sign. Said they were just updates to some insurance policies, nothing important. But when I asked to read them first, he became impatient, said I was being difficult and paranoid. I pretended to sign them, but I made sure the signature was illegible. When I looked up the insurance company later, I discovered the policy doesn't exist. What were those papers really for? Marcus was David's younger brother, the one who worked in finance and had always handled what the family diplomatically called Catherine's business affairs. I'd met him several times at family gatherings, and he'd always struck me as smooth and professional, maybe a little too interested in money, but I'd attributed that to his career choice. Reading Catherine's account of their interaction made me see those visits in a completely different light. But it was the entry from exactly 1 year ago that made my blood run cold. The plan is working perfectly. Harold believes I'm getting sicker by the day. I've been letting him see me taking different medications, complaining about pain, losing weight deliberately. Meanwhile, I've been secretly meeting with Thomas Chen, the lawyer in town that Harold doesn't know about. Thomas has helped me understand my legal options and has been incredibly kind about my unusual situation. The beautiful part is that my family's greed is actually helping me. Marcus has been so focused on positioning himself to inherit everything that he hasn't noticed. I've been gradually moving my real assets into accounts he doesn't know about. David keeps asking about the house and my investments, but he has no idea that most of what he thinks he'll inherit doesn't actually exist anymore. Next month, Catherine Whitmore will die of cancer, and her family will mourn appropriately while inheriting what they believe is a substantial estate. In reality, they'll get a house with a massive mortgage I took out recently, and some nearly worthless stock certificates I bought specifically for this purpose. The real Catherine will be starting over somewhere far from here, with enough money to live comfortably under a new name. I dropped the journal as if it had burned me. Catherine had faked her own death. She'd deliberately deceived her entire family, including David, the nephew who genuinely grieved for her. But as I forced myself to keep reading, I began to understand why. The entries from the months leading up to her supposed death revealed a family that had been systematically taking advantage of her. Marcus had been forging her signature on documents that transferred money from her accounts to various shell companies he'd created. David had been pressuring her to update her will, not out of concern for her welfare, but to ensure he'd inherit the house he'd already been eyeing for years. Even David's mother, Catherine's sister-in-law, had been involved, encouraging Catherine to be generous with family members who were struggling financially. "They've been stealing from me for years," Catherine had written. Small amounts at first, then larger sums as they realized I wasn't paying close attention. Marcus thinks I'm too old and confused to understand what he's doing with those papers he brings me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
David assumes I'm so grateful for his occasional visits that I won't question why he's suddenly so interested in my financial planning. They've all mistaken my kindness for stupidity, my reclusiveness for weakness. What they don't understand is that I've been keeping records of everything. Every forged document, every unauthorized withdrawal, every manipulation disguised as family concern. When Catherine Whitmore dies, She'll leave behind evidence of everything they've done. But I won't be there to see their faces when they realize their inheritance consists of debts and worthless papers. My mind reeled as I tried to reconcile this information with everything I thought I knew about my husband and his family. David had always presented himself as devoted to his aunt, concerned about her isolation but respectful of her privacy. He'd spoken movingly at her funeral about her kindness and generosity, about how much her quiet presence had meant to the family. Had all of that been an act? I thought back to the months before Catherine's death, trying to remember David's behavior and conversations. It was true that he'd started talking more frequently about his aunt's health and her living situation. He'd mentioned several times that the big house was too much for her to maintain, that she should consider selling it and moving into a retirement community. When I'd suggested we invite her to move in with us, he dismissed the idea quickly, saying she was too set in her ways and too independent to accept help. Now I wondered if his reluctance to have her live with us had less to do with her independence and more to do with his own plans for her estate. The final entries in the journal were the most disturbing of all. Catherine had documented her fake death with the methodical precision of someone who'd planned every detail. Thomas found a doctor in Montreal who's willing to provide the death certificate in exchange for a substantial fee. It helps that I actually have been losing weight and looking ill thanks to the stress of living with Harold and planning this escape. The doctor's report will show that I died of complications from breast cancer, which is believable given my family history and my apparent decline. Harold still doesn't know what's coming. He thinks I'm too weak and scared to leave him, too ashamed of what he's made me do to risk exposure. Tomorrow morning he'll wake up to find my note explaining that I couldn't live with the pain anymore, that I've gone to end my suffering in a place where he can't follow. By the time he figures out what really happened, I'll be on a bus to a new life. The house is mortgaged to the hilt now, and I've made sure all the valuable antiques and artwork have been replaced with high-quality reproductions. The family will get exactly what they deserve, and I'll finally be free. I sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the detritus of a woman's life, holding proof that everything I'd believed about my husband's family was a lie. Catherine wasn't dead. She was out there somewhere, living under a new identity, having escaped both an abusive relationship and a family that had been systematically stealing from her for years. But what made my chest tight with panic was the realization that David and I were living in Catherine's house, had been making plans based on what we thought was our inheritance, had built our future around assets that apparently didn't exist. We'd left our apartment in Boston, invested our savings in renovating this house, made financial decisions based on the assumption that we were now property owners with significant equity. If Catherine was telling the truth in her journal, if she'd mortgaged the house and replaced valuable items with fakes, then David and I weren't inheritors. We were victims of the same deception she'd used to escape her family's exploitation. I heard David's truck pulling into the driveway and quickly closed the journal, my mind racing. How was I supposed to confront him with this information? How could I ask my husband of 8 years if he'd been planning to defraud his dying aunt without destroying our marriage in the process? And what if he'd been innocent in all of this, genuinely caring for Catherine while his brother manipulated the situation behind the scenes? The front door slammed shut, and I heard David calling my name. I shoved the journal back into the trunk, closed the lid, and tried to compose myself, but my hands were still shaking, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Natalie, how's the attic project going?" David's voice echoed up from the second floor, getting closer as he climbed the stairs. I stood up quickly, brushing dust off my jeans and trying to look like I'd been doing nothing more significant than sorting through old Christmas decorations. But the journal's revelations felt like a weight in my chest, a secret too massive to hide for long. "Fine," I called back, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "Just getting started, really." David appeared at the top of the attic stairs, still in his work clothes, smelling like sawdust and the cold November air. He looked around the cluttered space with the same mixture of curiosity and distaste he'd shown every time we'd discussed tackling this project. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, stepping carefully between boxes to reach me. I looked at him, this man I'd married and trusted and built a life with, and realized I had no idea how to answer that question. Had he been part of Catherine's deception, Or had he been deceived along with me? Was he a victim or a perpetrator? The journal suggested he'd been actively involved in pressuring Catherine for financial gain, but I'd learned not to trust everything I read without verification. "Just a lot of old stuff," I said carefully. "Photos, clothes, the usual attic treasures." David nodded, already losing interest. "Well, don't feel like you have to go through everything today. We've got plenty of time to sort through it all." That casual comment hit me like a physical blow. We had plenty of time because we thought we owned this house now, because we believed Catherine had left us financially secure, because we assumed we were building our future on a solid foundation. But according to her journal, that foundation was built on lies and theft, and our security was an illusion that could crumble at any moment. As David headed back downstairs to shower, I stood alone in the attic, staring at the trunk that contained evidence of a deception so elaborate and far-reaching that I couldn't begin to guess what the truth really was. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't pretend I hadn't found that journal. I couldn't go back to believing the comfortable lies that had shaped our life until this moment. The afternoon sun was fading, casting long shadows across the cluttered attic, and I realized that my life had just divided into two distinct parts, before I found Catherine's journal and after. Everything I'd believed about my marriage, my home, and my future now felt uncertain and potentially false. And Catherine, wherever she was, had made sure that discovering the truth would be just the beginning of unraveling 30 years of carefully constructed lies. The next 3 days passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I cooked dinner, made conversation about David's work, and pretended to continue organizing the attic, while secretly devouring every page of Catherine's journals. Each entry revealed new layers of deception that made my stomach churn with dread and anger. David's behavior, which I'd always interpreted as loving concern for his aunt, took on sinister undertones when viewed through Catherine's perspective. The frequent phone calls about her health that I'd thought were sweet suddenly seemed calculating. The conversations about updating her will that he'd described as practical family planning now appeared predatory. Most disturbing were Catherine's detailed accounts of Marcus's visits, each one involving documents that transferred more of her assets to accounts controlled by the brothers. By Wednesday morning, I'd read through 6 different journals spanning the past 5 years. The pattern was unmistakable. David and Marcus had been systematically draining Catherine's accounts while she documented every theft. But what struck me most was how isolated she'd been. Harold's abuse had cut her off from friends and potential allies, while her family's financial exploitation had left her feeling like she had no one to trust. I was stirring my coffee and staring out the kitchen window when I noticed the mail truck pulling away from our neighbor's house. Linda Rodriguez lived in the small colonial next door and had been the only person to welcome us to the neighborhood when we'd moved in 2 months ago. She was probably in her 70s, a retired teacher with silver hair and knowing eyes who tended an impressive garden and seemed to notice everything that happened on Maple Street. Something Catherine had written in one of her later entries suddenly came back to me. "Linda from next door brought me soup yesterday when she saw me struggling with groceries. She's the only person who's shown me genuine kindness in years, and she doesn't even know me well. Sometimes strangers are safer than family." Quote, my pulse quickened. Linda had known Catherine. More than that, she might have information about what had really happened during those final months before Catherine's supposed death. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside, catching Linda as she was collecting her mail. "Good morning," I called, walking toward the property line between our houses. Linda looked up with a warm smile. "Natalie, how are you settling in? That's quite a project you've taken on with the old Whitmore place." "It's been an adjustment," I said carefully. "I've been going through Catherine's belongings, trying to understand more about her life. I get the feeling she was pretty isolated toward the end." Linda's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. She glanced toward our house, then back at me with what looked like careful consideration. "Catherine was a complicated woman," she said finally. "More complicated than your husband's family seemed to understand." The way she emphasized "seemed" made my heart race. "What do you mean by that?" Linda studied my face for a long moment. "Why don't you come in for coffee? There are some things about your predecessor that you might want to know." Inside Linda's cozy kitchen, surrounded by the warm smell of cinnamon and the soft ticking of an old mantel clock, She poured 2 cups of coffee and settled across from me at a small round table covered with a crocheted tablecloth. "How much did David tell you about Catherine's final months?" Linda asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Just that she was battling cancer, that she kept to herself mostly. He said she didn't want to burden the family with her illness." I wrapped my hands around the warm coffee mug, trying to appear casual while my nerves felt electrified. Linda's laugh held no humor. "Burden the family? That woman was carrying the family, financially speaking, for years before she died. Or before she supposedly died." The coffee mug nearly slipped from my hands. "Supposedly died?" Linda leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the fact that we were alone in her kitchen. "Natalie, I taught high school for 43 years. I know when someone is lying, and I know when someone is afraid. Catherine Whitmore was terrified during her last months here, but it wasn't because of cancer." My mouth went dry. What was she afraid of? That man she was living with, for starters. Harold. Big, angry-looking fellow who'd show up at all hours, usually when she was getting mail or working in the garden. He'd grab her arm, whisper something in her ear, and she'd go white as a sheet and hurry back inside. I stared at Linda in shock. Harold was living with her? But David said he died in Vietnam decades ago. "Harold Brennan died in Vietnam," Linda corrected. "Harold Walsh has been terrorizing Catherine for 30 years. She told me the whole story about 6 months before she disappeared." "Disappeared?" I could barely whisper the word. Linda nodded grimly. "Catherine didn't die of cancer, honey. She ran. And from what she told me, she had good reason to." The room seemed to tilt around me. Linda's words confirmed what I'd read in the journals, but hearing it from someone who'd actually known Catherine made it real in a way that shook me to my core. "She came to me one evening last spring," Linda continued, "crying and scared. Said she needed someone to know the truth in case something happened to her. Harold wasn't just abusing her physically and emotionally, he was blackmailing her with photographs and documents from when she was younger and more vulnerable. Apparently, he'd forced her into some compromising situations and had evidence he threatened to show her family. I thought about Catherine's journal entries describing the shame that had kept her trapped. But why didn't she just leave? Why fake her death?" "Because Harold wasn't the only problem," Linda said, her voice heavy with sadness. "Your husband and his brother had been stealing from her for years. Marcus would bring papers for her to sign, claiming they were routine financial updates, but Catherine had secretly copied everything. They were emptying her accounts, transferring property, even taking out loans against her house." My hands began to shake. "David knew about this?" "Catherine showed me some recordings she'd made," Linda said quietly. "Phone conversations where David was coaching Marcus on how to approach her about various financial documents. Your husband wasn't an innocent bystander, Natalie. He was the mastermind." The coffee tasted like acid in my mouth. Everything I'd believed about my marriage, about David's character, about our life together, was crumbling around me. The recordings, does Catherine still have them? Linda's smile was sad but knowing. Catherine was smarter than any of them gave her credit for. She left copies of everything with someone she trusted before she staged her death. Someone who's been waiting to see what would happen when the truth finally came out. "Who?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. "Thomas Chen, the lawyer downtown. Catherine hired him secretly about a year before she disappeared. He's been holding on to evidence that would destroy your husband and his brother if it ever came to light." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Why hasn't he done anything, if he has proof they were stealing from her? "Because Catherine asked him to wait," Linda explained. She wanted to see if David would come forward on his own once he realized the inheritance was worthless. She hoped that maybe, deep down, he had enough conscience to admit what he'd done and try to make amends. "And if he didn't?" Linda's expression hardened. "Then Thomas has instructions to turn everything over to the authorities, but Catherine also left something else. A way for an innocent family member to avoid being destroyed along with the guilty ones." My pulse pounded in my ears. "What kind of way?" "She left a letter, addressed to David's wife. To you, specifically, though she didn't know your name at the time. Catherine suspected that David's spouse might be as much a victim as she was. I stared at Linda in amazement. She left me a letter? Thomas has it. Along with enough evidence to send David and Marcus to prison for fraud, elder abuse, and theft. But Catherine's letter also includes information that could protect you if you're willing to help expose what they did. The weight of possibility settled over me like a heavy blanket. Catherine had anticipated this moment, had planned for the discovery of her deception, and prepared a way forward for someone in exactly my position. What did she want me to do? I asked. Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She wanted you to have a choice. You could walk away, pretend you never learned the truth, and hope that David's crimes never catch up with you. Or you could help Thomas gather the final pieces of evidence needed to bring them to justice. What kind of evidence? Current financial records, documentation of how David and Marcus have been handling what they think is their inheritance, proof of ongoing fraud. Catherine's evidence only goes up to the point of her disappearance. Thomas needs someone on the inside to document what's happened since then. I thought about our move to Vermont, the renovations we'd started on the house, the financial decisions we'd made based on what David had told me about our inheritance. If Catherine had mortgaged the house and replaced valuable items with worthless replicas, then David and I had been living a lie for months. Linda, when you say the inheritance was worthless, what exactly do you mean? Linda's expression grew pained. Catherine mortgaged this house to the hilt in the months before she left. The beautiful antique furniture you've been living with? High-quality reproductions she bought specifically to replace the valuable pieces she sold. The stock certificates and bonds Marcus thought he'd inherit? Catherine cashed them all out and donated the money to domestic violence shelters. My stomach dropped. So the house is worth less than what's owed on it. Catherine made sure the family would inherit her debts, not her assets. She figured it was poetic justice for people who'd been stealing from her for years. I buried my face in my hands as the full scope of our situation hit me. David and I had quit our jobs in Boston, used our savings for the move and renovations, and were planning our future around assets that didn't exist. We were financially ruined, and David didn't even know it yet. There's something else, Linda said gently. Catherine suspected that David might try to blame his wife when the truth came out. She included specific instructions in her letter about protecting yourself legally and financially. I looked up sharply. What kind of instructions? I don't know the details, but Thomas mentioned that Catherine had prepared multiple scenarios depending on how much David's wife knew about his activities. She wanted to make sure an innocent person wouldn't be destroyed by her plan for revenge. The irony was overwhelming. Catherine, a woman I'd never met, was offering me more protection and consideration than my own husband had. While David had been lying to me about our financial situation and dragging me into his fraud, Catherine had been planning ways to shield me from the consequences. When can I see Thomas? I asked. Linda smiled for the first time since our conversation began. I'll call him this afternoon. But Natalie, you need to understand what you're getting into. If you help Thomas gather evidence against David and Marcus, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over, and your husband will likely go to prison. I thought about the David I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago, the man who'd seemed kind and ambitious and devoted to family. Then I thought about the David Catherine had described in her journals, the one who'd systematically stolen from a vulnerable elderly woman and lied to his wife about their future. The man I married doesn't exist, does he? I said quietly. Linda's expression was full of compassion. Honey, I watched Catherine struggle with the same realization about Harold. Sometimes the people we love show us only the parts of themselves they want us to see. But Catherine found the strength to save herself. And so can you. That evening, David came home from work with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, chattering about his day and asking about my progress in the attic. I watched him across our kitchen table, Catherine's kitchen table, and marveled at how normal he seemed. How could someone living with such massive deception appear so relaxed and genuine? Find anything interesting up there today? He asked, exactly as he had every day since I'd started the project. Just more of the same. I lied, becoming increasingly skilled at deception myself, though I did have coffee with Linda next door. She was telling me about Catherine's final months. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Oh, what did she have to say? Just that Catherine seemed anxious toward the end. Linda thought maybe she was in more pain than she let on. David nodded, his expression appropriately sympathetic. Aunt Catherine always was too proud to ask for help. I tried to get her to consider home care, but she refused. The casual lie rolled off his tongue so easily that it took my breath away. According to Catherine's journals, David had never offered to arrange care for her. In fact, he'd actively discouraged her from hiring help because it would make it harder for Marcus to manipulate her finances. Linda mentioned seeing a man at the house sometimes, I said, watching David's reaction carefully. She thought maybe Catherine had a boyfriend. This time David did stop eating. A boyfriend? That's impossible. Aunt Catherine never got involved with anyone after her fiancé died in Vietnam. Linda was pretty certain. She said he was there quite often, especially in the evenings. David shook his head dismissively. Linda's getting on in years, probably just saw Marcus or me coming by to check on her. But I'd seen the flash of something in his eyes when I mentioned the man. Fear, maybe, or concern that Linda had seen too much. David knew about Harold, I realized. He might not have known the full extent of Catherine's situation, but he knew she wasn't living alone. After dinner, while David watched television, I slipped back up to the attic and retrieved Catherine's most recent journal. By flashlight, I read her final entries, looking for any mention of David's knowledge about Harold. I found it in an entry dated just 2 weeks before her disappearance. David came by unexpectedly this afternoon while Harold was here. I managed to get Harold out the back door before David saw him, but I could tell David suspected something. He kept looking around, asking if I was sure I was living alone, if I felt safe in the big house by myself. When I insisted I was fine, he got that calculating look he gets when he's trying to figure out an advantage. Later, I overheard him on the phone with Marcus, saying something about complications and needing to accelerate the timeline. I think David suspects I'm not as isolated and vulnerable as they've assumed. That makes him more dangerous, not less. If he realizes Harold has been controlling me, he might try to use that information somehow. The next entry was even more disturbing. Marcus confronted me today about Harold. He knows. Somehow, they both know about the abuse and the blackmail, and instead of helping me, they're trying to figure out how to use it to their advantage. Marcus actually said I should be grateful that family was looking out for my interests, since I clearly couldn't take care of myself. The worst part is that they're not wrong about Harold having power over me. But they don't care about my safety or my dignity. They just want to make sure I don't do anything that might interfere with their inheritance. They're willing to let Harold continue abusing me as long as it keeps me compliant and easy to manipulate. I closed the journal and sat in the darkness of the attic, overwhelmed by the depth of cruelty Catherine had endured. Her own family had known about her abusive situation and had chosen to exploit it rather than help her. No wonder she'd felt she had no choice but to fake her death and disappear. But Catherine had been smarter and stronger than any of them had realized. She'd documented everything, planned her escape meticulously, and even prepared a way to protect innocent family members like me. She'd turned the tables on people who'd underestimated her, and now it was my turn to decide whether to honor her courage or hide from the truth. I made my decision in that dusty attic, surrounded by the remnants of a woman who'd found the strength to save herself from people who should have protected her. Tomorrow, I would call Thomas Chen and learn exactly what Catherine had left for me. I would begin gathering the evidence needed to expose David and Marcus for what they really were. Catherine had spent 30 years as a victim before finding her way to freedom. I refused to spend another day as one of their unwitting accomplices. It was time to discover what justice looked like, and whether I had the courage to pursue it. The irony wasn't lost on me that Catherine, a woman I'd never met, was about to become my greatest ally in exposing the lies my own husband had built our marriage on. But as I sat in her house, surrounded by her memories and protected by her foresight, I felt less alone than I had since finding that first journal. Catherine had left me a roadmap to the truth. Now I had to decide whether I was brave enough to follow it. Thomas Chen's law office occupied the second floor of a brick building on Main Street that looked like it had been there since Millbrook was founded. The narrow staircase creaked under my feet as I climbed to his door, my palms sweating despite the November chill. Linda had arranged this meeting for Friday afternoon, when David would be at work and wouldn't question my absence from the house. The waiting area was small but comfortable, filled with leather-bound legal books and the smell of old paper. Thomas himself was younger than I'd expected, maybe in his early 50s, with graying temples and intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm and reassuring. "Mrs. Parker, please sit down. Linda has told me some of your situation, but I'd like to hear it from you directly." I settled into the chair across from his desk, noting the thick folder already waiting there, with my name written on the tab in neat handwriting. "I found Catherine's journals in the attic. I know she didn't die of cancer, and I know David and Marcus have been stealing from her." Thomas nodded slowly. "What exactly did the journals tell you?" For the next 20 minutes, I summarized everything I'd read. Catherine's documentation of financial theft, her abusive relationship with Harold, her family's willingness to exploit her vulnerability, and her elaborate plan to fake her death and escape. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "That matches what Catherine told me when she first came to see me," he said when I finished, "but there are details in her journals that she never shared with me directly. The extent of David's involvement, for instance. She suspected he was coordinating with Marcus, but she didn't have proof of direct communication between them." Thomas opened the folder and withdrew a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Catherine's careful script. "Before we go any further, Catherine wanted you to read this. She wrote it specifically for David's spouse, anticipating that whoever he married might eventually discover the truth." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "Dear Natalie," it began, and seeing my name in Catherine's handwriting made my breath catch. "If you're reading this, it means my plan worked, and the truth about David's character has finally come to light. I'm sorry you had to discover it this way, and I'm sorry for the pain this knowledge must be causing you. By now you know that I'm not dead, that I staged my disappearance to escape both Harold's abuse and my family's theft. You also know that David has been systematically stealing from me for years, with Marcus handling the technical aspects while David provided the emotional manipulation necessary to keep me compliant. What you may not realize is how carefully David has positioned you to take the blame if his crimes are ever discovered. The house you're living in is mortgaged beyond its value, using documents that bear David's forged version of my signature. The renovation loan David took out in both your names was based on fraudulent appraisals of assets that no longer exist. If the authorities investigate, they'll find that you benefited financially from the theft, even though you knew nothing about it." My stomach clenched as I read those words. David had taken out a renovation loan using both our names? I'd never signed any loan documents since we'd moved to Vermont. Thomas has copies of everything David and Marcus did, including the loan applications with your forged signature. David has been planning to sacrifice you if necessary to save himself. He's already established a paper trail showing that you were the one pushing for quick access to the inheritance money, that you pressured him to take out loans against the house, that you were impatient to claim assets that weren't legally yours yet. The letter continued with details that made my blood run cold. David had been creating fake email accounts in my name, sending messages to financial institutions that made it appear I was the driving force behind their fraudulent activities. He'd been documenting conversations we'd never had, creating evidence that I was greedy and manipulative and eager to profit from Catherine's death. If you choose to expose what David has done, you'll need to protect yourself first. Thomas has prepared legal documents that will shield you from prosecution in exchange for your cooperation with the investigation. But once you sign them, there's no going back. David will know you've betrayed him, and he'll do everything possible to destroy you. I wish I could tell you there's an easy path forward, but there isn't. You can walk away now, leave David, and start over somewhere else. The authorities might never discover what he did, and you could build a new life without being connected to his crimes. Or you can help Thomas gather the evidence needed to bring David and Marcus to justice, knowing that doing so will require tremendous courage and will likely destroy everything you thought your marriage was built on. Whatever you choose, please know that none of this is your fault. David selected you as his wife the same way Harold selected me as his victim, by identifying someone kind and trusting who wouldn't suspect the manipulation until it was too late. The difference is that you have options I never had, and people willing to help you that I never found until it was almost too late." The letter was signed simply Catherine, with a postscript that made tears spring to my eyes. "I left a small trust fund in your name, accessible regardless of what you decide about David. You deserve security and freedom, and I hope you find the courage to claim both." I set the letter down with shaking hands and looked up at Thomas, who had been watching my reaction carefully. "She really thought of everything," I whispered. "Catherine was remarkable," Thomas agreed. "One of the most methodical and intelligent clients I've ever worked with. She spent months planning every detail of her escape and the consequences for everyone involved." The trust fund she mentioned, $50,000, held in an account with only your name on it. Catherine funded it by selling jewelry and small antiques over several months. She wanted to make sure David's wife would have resources to leave him if necessary. I stared at Thomas in amazement. Catherine had been protecting me before she even knew who I was, setting aside money to help a woman she'd never met escape from her nephew's lies. The generosity of it was overwhelming. What about the legal protection she mentioned? Thomas opened another folder and withdrew a set of documents. Immunity agreement with the district attorney's office. Catherine provided them with preliminary evidence of David and Marcus's activities over a year ago. They've been waiting for additional proof to move forward with charges. If you agree to cooperate fully and provide current evidence of ongoing fraud, they'll guarantee you won't be prosecuted. What kind of evidence do they need? Documentation of how David has been handling the inheritance since Catherine's supposed death. Financial records, loan applications, anything that shows he's continuing to commit fraud. They also need proof that you were unaware of his activities. Thomas slid a small device across the desk. "This is a voice recorder. If you can get David to talk about what he and Marcus did, about their plans for the inheritance money, that would be invaluable evidence." The weight of the recorder in my palm felt enormous. Thomas was asking me to spy on my husband, to gather evidence that would send him to prison. But I thought about Catherine's letter, about David's plan to blame me for his crimes, about the forged signatures and fake emails he'd created in my name. How long have the authorities known about this? Catherine first contacted them 18 months ago, when she realized the scope of what David and Marcus were doing. She'd been trying to handle the situation quietly, hoping they'd stop on their own. But the theft was escalating. She was afraid they might try to have her declared incompetent or even physically harm her if she tried to cut off their access to her money. So they've been investigating all along? Building a case, yes. But Catherine's disappearance complicated things. Without a victim to testify, they needed more evidence. When she staged her death, it actually made prosecution more difficult because officially there was no longer a crime victim. I thought about the implications. But if Catherine is still alive, can't she just come forward and testify against them? Thomas's expression grew sad. Catherine is terminally ill. The cancer she claimed to be dying from? It's real, though not as advanced as she pretended. She has maybe 6 months left, and she spent the last year of her life in hiding, dealing with Harold's attempts to find her. She's not strong enough to endure a lengthy trial, and she's terrified that Harold will track her down if her location becomes public record. The tragedy of Catherine's situation hit me anew. Even in escaping her abusers, she was still being victimized by them. Harold was hunting for her, David and Marcus had stolen her life savings, and she was facing death alone and afraid. "Where is she now?" I asked. "I can't tell you that for her protection and yours. But she's safe, and she's being cared for by people who understand her situation." Thomas reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small wrapped package. "She asked me to give you this if you decided to help." Inside the package was a delicate gold locket, old and obviously valuable. When I opened it, I found a photo of a young woman who looked remarkably like me. The same dark hair, the same shaped face, the same stubborn chin. Catherine's sister, David's Aunt Rachel. She died in a car accident when David was 10. Catherine said you reminded her of Rachel, and she thought you should have something that belonged to her. The locket felt warm in my palm, a tangible connection to a family history I was only beginning to understand. Catherine wasn't just protecting me out of general kindness. She saw something of her beloved sister in me, and she was trying to save me from the same family that had destroyed so many others. "What do I need to do?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Thomas smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "First, we need to document your current financial situation. Bring me copies of all your joint accounts, credit reports, loan documents, anything that shows how your finances have changed since Catherine's death." He handed me a business card. "This is Janet Morrison, a forensic accountant who works with the district attorney's office. She'll help you understand exactly what David has done with your money and your credit. Some of it can be undone if we act quickly." "What about the house?" "The house is the centerpiece of their fraud. Catherine made sure it would be worthless to them, but David has been borrowing against it using forged documents. You're going to need to move out soon, before the mortgage company realizes what's happening." The practical implications were staggering. I would need to find a place to live, separate my finances from David's, and extract myself from years of shared commitments and investments. The life we'd built together was about to disappear completely. "Thomas, when I confront David with this evidence, what's going to happen? David is going to deny everything. Then he's going to try to convince you that you're imagining things or misunderstanding the situation. When that doesn't work, he'll probably become angry and try to intimidate you into staying quiet. Eventually, he'll try to blame you for everything and claim you were the one who pressured him into the fraud." Thomas's description matched exactly what Catherine had predicted in her letter. David's reactions were so predictable that a woman he'd been stealing from could anticipate them months in advance. "What about Marcus?" "Marcus is facing separate charges for elder abuse and financial exploitation. He's been doing this to other elderly clients, not just Catherine. When David realizes the scope of the investigation, he'll probably try to make a deal by testifying against his brother." The image of David and Marcus turning on each other would have been satisfying if it weren't so tragic. These were men I'd considered family, people I'd trusted and cared about, and they were criminals who'd been using me as cover for their activities. "How long do we have before they figure out what's happening?" "Not long. The district attorney wants to move forward with arrests within the next 2 weeks. They've been waiting for you to surface as a potential witness, but they're not going to wait much longer. 2 weeks to gather evidence, separate my life from David's, and prepare for the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my marriage." It seemed impossible, but Catherine had managed to plan her entire escape in less time than that. "I'll need help," I said finally. "You'll have it. Linda has offered to let you stay with her when you're ready to leave the house. Janet can help you secure your finances and credit. I'll handle all the legal aspects and coordinate with the prosecutors. You won't be alone in this." I spent the rest of the afternoon with Janet Morrison, learning the extent of David's financial deception. The news was worse than I'd imagined. David had opened credit cards in both our names, taken out personal loans using our joint assets as collateral, and even applied for a second mortgage on the house without my knowledge. Our supposed inheritance was entirely fictional. The house was mortgaged for more than its current value, the antiques we'd been living with were worthless reproductions, and the investment accounts David claimed to have inherited didn't exist. We weren't wealthy new homeowners building our dream life. We were victims of an elaborate fraud that had left us hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. "The good news," Janet said as she showed me printouts of our financial situation, "is that most of this can be unwound once we prove the fraud. The banks don't want to be holding worthless collateral any more than you want to be responsible for fraudulent debt. What about our apartment in Boston? Our savings account?" Janet's expression was grim. "David cleaned out your joint savings 3 months ago to make the down payment on the renovation loan. As for the apartment, he used your security deposit and final month's rent as partial payment for moving expenses he charged to one of the credit cards he opened in your name." The betrayal was so complete, so thoroughly planned, that I felt physically sick. David hadn't just lied to me about Catherine's inheritance. He'd systematically stolen everything I'd worked for and saved over the past 8 years. "How could I have missed all of this?" I asked. "Because David handled all the finances and you trusted him," Janet said simply. "This is a classic pattern in financial abuse cases. The victim has no reason to suspect fraud until it's too late to prevent it." That evening, I returned to the house with a recording device hidden in my jacket pocket and a heart full of dread. David was in the kitchen making dinner, humming softly to himself as he chopped vegetables. He looked up with a smile when I walked in, the same warm expression I'd fallen in love with years ago. "How was your day?" he asked, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Make any progress in the attic?" The casual normalcy of the question, combined with everything I'd learned that day, made my stomach turn. David was asking about my day while knowing that I was living in a house he'd mortgaged fraudulently, surrounded by belongings that weren't real, building a future on money that didn't exist. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about some financial things," I said, settling at the kitchen table with my heart pounding. "I've been thinking about our budget since we moved here, and I realize I don't really understand our current situation." David's knife paused for just a moment before continuing its steady rhythm. "What do you mean?" "Well, we paid for the move, we've been renovating, we're living in this beautiful house, but I haven't seen any paperwork about Catherine's estate. No probate documents, no inheritance records, nothing that shows how much money we actually have." David set down the knife and turned to face me, his expression carefully concerned. "Honey, you know I handle all that complicated legal stuff. There's no reason for you to worry about the details." "I'm not worried," I lied. "I just want to understand. This is a big change for us financially, and I'd like to know where we stand." David dried his hands on a dish towel, buying time to think. I could see the calculation in his eyes as he decided how much truth he could safely tell me. "The estate is still being settled," he said finally. "These things take time. But Marcus has been handling the paperwork, and he says everything looks good. We're secure." The lie came so easily that I wondered how many others he'd told me over the years without my realizing it. According to Thomas, there was no estate to settle. Catherine had made sure of that before she disappeared. "What about the renovation loan you mentioned?" "I don't remember signing any loan papers." This time, David's pause was longer, more noticeable. When he turned back to his cooking, his shoulders were tense. "You signed them, Natalie. Maybe you just don't remember. There were a lot of documents that week we moved in." Another lie. Janet had shown me the loan application with my forged signature, had pointed out the differences in handwriting that proved I'd never signed anything. "David, I'm pretty sure I'd remember signing loan documents for $50,000. David's hands stilled completely. In the silence that followed, I could hear the refrigerator humming and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "Why are you asking me all these questions?" he said without turning around. "Since when do you not trust me to handle our finances?" The shift in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. The warm, patient husband was being replaced by someone cooler, more defensive. Someone who didn't like being questioned about his lies. "I'm just trying to understand our situation," I said carefully. "If we're going to be living here long term, I want to know what our financial obligations are." David finally turned to face me, and his expression was different now. Harder. More calculating. For the first time since I'd known him, I felt like I was seeing the man Catherine had described in her journals. "Our situation is fine, Natalie. I've been managing money successfully long before I met you, and I don't need you second-guessing my decisions now." The condescension in his voice was shocking. In 8 years of marriage, David had never spoken to me like that. But as I looked at him across Catherine's kitchen, I realized this might be the first time I'd ever truly challenged him about anything important. "I'm not second-guessing anything," I said, working to keep my voice level. "I'm asking questions about documents that affect both of us. That seems reasonable." David's laugh was cold and unfamiliar. "Reasonable? You want to know what's reasonable? Trusting your husband to handle complex financial matters, instead of interrogating him like he's some kind of criminal." The word, criminal, hung in the air between us, loaded with irony he didn't know I could appreciate. David was a criminal, and he was so accustomed to manipulation and deception that he couldn't conceive of having an honest conversation about money with his own wife. "David, I just want to see the paperwork. Show me the estate documents, the loan agreement, anything that explains how we can afford to live like this. I'm not trying to cause problems." David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him making some kind of decision. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "Fine. I'll get Marcus to send over copies of everything this weekend. But I want you to understand something, Natalie. This inheritance is the best thing that's ever happened to us. Don't let paranoia ruin our future." I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the reassured wife while the recording device captured every word of his lies and threats. David thought he was managing me, manipulating me back into compliance the same way he'd manipulated Catherine for years. But Catherine had prepared me for this moment, had given me the tools and knowledge I needed to see through his deception. As David returned to cooking dinner, humming again as if nothing had happened, I sat at the table planning my next moves. Within 2 weeks, David would be under arrest. Within a month, I'd be starting a new life with Catherine's trust fund, and the knowledge that I'd helped bring justice to a woman who'd been wronged by everyone she should have been able to trust. The man making dinner in Catherine's kitchen wasn't my husband anymore. He was a stranger who'd been wearing David's face, and tomorrow I would begin the process of exposing him for what he really was. The weekend arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt ominous, as if the weather itself was holding its breath. David had promised to get documents from Marcus, but Saturday morning came and went without any mention of paperwork. He puttered around the house, fixing a loose cabinet door and organizing his toolbox, acting like our conversation about finances had never happened. I spent the morning in the attic, ostensibly continuing my sorting project but actually photographing every page of Catherine's journals with my phone. Thomas had requested digital copies of everything, and I wanted to make sure nothing was lost if David discovered what I'd found. Each photograph felt like preserving evidence of a crime, documenting the systematic destruction of a woman's life by people who should have protected her. Around noon, I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the window, I watched Marcus climb out of his silver BMW, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to have been purchased with Catherine's money. He walked to the front door with the confident stride of someone who believed himself untouchable, someone who'd gotten away with stealing for so long that he'd forgotten it was even illegal. "Marcus is here," David called up the stairs. "Come down and say hello." I made my way downstairs with my pulse racing, knowing this might be my only chance to record both brothers discussing their crimes. The device in my pocket felt heavy with possibility and danger. Marcus was standing in the living room, looking around with the satisfied expression of someone surveying his future inheritance. He'd always been handsome in a polished way, with perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes that screamed success. But knowing what I knew now, his appearance seemed like a costume designed to hide his true nature. "Natalie, good to see you," he said, giving me a brief hug that felt calculated and false. "David tells me you've been asking questions about Aunt Catherine's estate." The directness caught me off guard. I'd expected him to dance around the subject, not address it immediately. "I'm just trying to understand our financial situation. It's all been pretty overwhelming." Marcus nodded sympathetically. "Of course it has. Inheriting significant assets always comes with complications. That's why David asked me to handle the technical aspects while you two focus on settling into your new life." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder filled with official-looking documents. "These should answer most of your questions about the estate's value and timeline for distribution." I accepted the folder with hands I hoped weren't visibly shaking. The papers inside looked legitimate at first glance, complete with letterheads from law firms and financial institutions. But as I scanned the contents, I realized they were elaborate fakes. Account statements showing balances that didn't exist. Property appraisals for items Catherine had sold months before her disappearance. Legal documents bearing signatures I now knew were forgeries. "This shows the house appraised at $400,000, I said, reading from one of the documents. "That's a conservative estimate," Marcus replied smoothly. "With the improvements you've been making, it's probably worth closer to $500,000 by now." According to Janet Morrison, the house was worth less than $200,000 in its current condition, and it carried a mortgage of nearly $300,000 that David and Marcus had fraudulently secured using Catherine's name. "What about these investment accounts?" I asked, pointing to statements showing substantial stock portfolios and bond holdings. David leaned over my shoulder, playing his part in their elaborate deception. "Those are the accounts Marcus has been managing for the family. Pretty impressive returns, right?" The statements were complete fabrications. Catherine had liquidated all her legitimate investments before disappearing, donating the proceeds to domestic violence shelters. But David and Marcus had no way of knowing I'd discovered that fact. I have to admit, I'm surprised by how much Catherine was worth, I said carefully. She always seemed so modest in her lifestyle. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. Aunt Catherine was old school about money. She didn't believe in flashy spending, preferred to let her wealth grow quietly. Smart woman, really, even if she was a bit eccentric toward the end. Eccentric how? I asked, sensing an opportunity to get them talking. The brothers exchanged a quick glance, some silent communication passing between them. Marcus cleared his throat before answering. Well, you know she was living with that boyfriend of hers, Harold something. Strange relationship for a woman her age, especially considering how secretive she was about it. My blood chilled. They knew about Harold, knew about Catherine's abusive situation, and they were discussing it like gossip rather than tragedy. I didn't know she had a boyfriend, I said, letting curiosity color my voice. David never mentioned him. Because it was embarrassing, David said, his tone dismissive. A woman in her 60s, acting like a teenager with some man she refused to introduce to the family. She'd get all flustered if you asked about him, change the subject immediately. The callousness of his description made me physically sick. Catherine hadn't been embarrassed about Harold. She'd been terrified of him. Her secrecy hadn't been born of romantic shyness, but of fear for her safety and shame about the abuse she was enduring. Did you ever meet him? I asked. Marcus shook his head. She kept him completely separate from family. But I saw him a few times when I visited her. Big guy, probably 10 years younger than Catherine. Always seemed angry about something. Angry how? Just his whole demeanor, Marcus continued, seeming to enjoy having an audience for his observations. He'd watch me from the windows when I was there for business, like he was suspicious of Catherine having any contact with family. A couple of times he actually came to the door and told me Catherine was too tired for visitors. David nodded along with his brother's account. That's when we started worrying she was being isolated. An older woman, not thinking clearly because of her illness, being controlled by some stranger who probably saw her as a meal ticket. The irony was staggering. David and Marcus had been genuinely concerned about Catherine being exploited by Harold while simultaneously exploiting her themselves. They'd correctly identified the signs of financial abuse while actively perpetrating it. So what did you do about it? I asked. We tried to increase our visits, make sure she knew she could count on family support, David said, his voice taking on the righteous tone of someone convinced of their own nobility. But she kept insisting everything was fine. The Harold was just helping her around the house. Marcus leaned forward, warming to the subject. The frustrating thing was that she obviously needed protection, but she was too proud or too confused to accept help. We tried to discuss her financial security, make sure she had proper legal protections in place, and she'd get defensive. Legal protections? Updated will, power of attorney documents, that sort of thing, Marcus explained. Basic precautions for someone her age, especially with a stranger in the picture. But Catherine acted like we were trying to control her when we were actually trying to protect her from being controlled by someone else. I marveled at his ability to reframe theft as protection, to present forgery and fraud as family concern. Marcus had convinced himself that stealing from Catherine was actually a form of rescue, that bilking her of her life savings was somehow noble. Did she ever update those documents? Eventually, David said. It took months of gentle persuasion, but she finally agreed to put proper safeguards in place, made sure the family would be protected if Harold tried to manipulate her into leaving him everything. They were talking about the forged will, the fake power of attorney, the fraudulent documents they'd used to gain access to Catherine's accounts. In their version of events, they were heroes protecting a vulnerable woman from a predator, not realizing they were describing themselves. That must have been a relief, I said, fighting to keep my voice neutral. Huge relief, Marcus agreed, especially when she got sicker toward the end. We knew Harold was probably pressuring her to make financial decisions she wasn't capable of making clearly. Having legal authority to intervene gave us peace of mind. The recording device in my pocket was capturing every word of their self-justifying lies. They genuinely seemed to believe their own narrative, had convinced themselves that fraud was protection and theft was love. What happened to Harold after Catherine died? I asked. Both brothers looked uncomfortable with that question. David cleared his throat and looked at Marcus, who shifted in his chair before answering. He disappeared pretty quickly after the funeral. Probably realized there wasn't anything left for him to take. Left for him to take? Well, you know how these situations work, Marcus said, his tone becoming more guarded. Older woman, younger man, sudden illness. He was probably expecting to inherit something, and when he found out Catherine had left everything to family, he moved on to the next victim. The casual way they discussed Harold's motivations revealed how clearly they understood predatory behavior, because they'd been engaging in it themselves. They recognized Harold as a threat to Catherine's assets because he was competition for the money they'd been stealing. Did he cause problems during the estate settlement? David and Marcus exchanged another look, this one more worried than the previous ones. He tried to, David said finally. Made some ridiculous claims about being Catherine's common-law husband, said he had legal rights to the house and her belongings. What kind of claims? Marcus opened his briefcase again and withdrew another document, this one with Harold's name on it. He actually filed paperwork claiming Catherine had promised to marry him and leave him everything. Complete nonsense, of course, but it held up probate for several weeks while the courts sorted through his lies. I scanned the document, recognizing Harold's signature from Catherine's journals, but the claims he was making weren't about marriage or inheritance. They were about debts Catherine supposedly owed him for years of support and care. He says here that Catherine borrowed money from him to pay medical expenses, I said, reading from the filing. All lies, David said quickly. Harold was just trying to get his hands on family assets by claiming Catherine owed him money. The courts saw right through it. But according to the document, Harold wasn't claiming Catherine owed him money. He was claiming that David and Marcus owed him money, that they'd made agreements with him to share in Catherine's estate in exchange for his help in managing her during her illness. This is confusing, I said, looking up from the papers. Harold is saying you two promised him a cut of the inheritance in exchange for keeping Catherine isolated and compliant. The silence that followed my statement was deafening. Both brothers stared at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Not guilt exactly, but the kind of careful blankness that comes when someone is trying desperately not to reveal what they're thinking. That's completely false, Marcus said finally, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. Harold was clearly desperate and willing to say anything to get money, David added, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked back down at the document, reading more carefully this time. Harold's filing included specific details about meetings with David and Marcus, dates and times when they'd allegedly discussed their mutual interest in controlling Catherine's finances. It described payments Harold claimed he'd received for information about Catherine's daily routines, her mental state, and her access to her accounts. He's very specific about these meetings, I said. He even includes bank records showing payments from accounts linked to you, Marcus. Marcus stood up abruptly, his calm facade finally cracking. Harold is a con artist who tried to extort money from the family during our time of grief. The fact that you're giving any credence to his lies is honestly insulting. His defensive anger was so different from his previous smooth confidence that it confirmed everything I'd been suspecting. Harold's claims weren't lies. They were truth. David and Marcus had been working with Harold, using him to control and manipulate Catherine while they stole from her. I'm not giving credence to anything, I said mildly. I'm just trying to understand what happened. If Harold was helping you keep Catherine safe from financial exploitation, why would that be something to hide? Because that's not what happened, David said, his voice rising. Harold was exploiting Catherine, and we were trying to protect her. The fact that he's now trying to twist that into some kind of conspiracy just proves what kind of person he is. But the bank records in Harold's filing showed regular payments from Marcus's account to Harold's account over a period of 18 months. The amounts weren't large, a few $100s at a time, but they followed a clear pattern. Every time Harold provided information about Catherine's activities or state of mind, Marcus made a payment. These bank records suggest otherwise, I said, holding up the document. There's a pretty clear pattern of payments corresponding to dates when Harold reported on Catherine's condition. David snatched the paper from my hands, his face flushed with anger I'd never seen before. You know what, Natalie? I'm getting really tired of this interrogation. These are complicated legal matters that you don't understand, and I don't appreciate you questioning my integrity based on the lies of someone who was literally abusing my aunt. The mask was finally slipping completely. The loving, patient husband was disappearing, replaced by someone cold and threatening. This was the David that Catherine had written about in her journals, the one who became dangerous when his lies were challenged. "I'm not questioning your integrity," I said, working to keep my voice calm. "I'm trying to understand what happened to Catherine and how it affects our current situation." "What affects our current situation is that we inherited a substantial estate from a family member who trusted us to handle it responsibly," Marcus said, his tone now openly hostile. "What doesn't affect our situation is the desperate lies of a man who tried to extort money from us during a difficult time." I looked at both brothers, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. They weren't just thieves. They were collaborators who'd worked with Catherine's abuser to steal from her while she was at her most vulnerable. They'd paid Harold for information that helped them manipulate her, then abandoned him when Catherine died, and he was no longer useful to them. "Where is Harold now?" I asked. "Who cares?" David snapped. "He's probably moved on to victimize some other elderly woman. That's what predators do. They find vulnerable targets and exploit them until there's nothing left to take." The self-awareness was stunning. David was describing himself and Marcus perfectly while believing he was talking about someone else. Did the police ever investigate Harold's claims? Both brothers went very still. Marcus closed his briefcase with deliberate precision, and David set Harold's document on the coffee table like it had burned him. "The police determined that Harold's claims were baseless," Marcus said finally. "The case was closed." "What case?" Another silence, longer and more uncomfortable than before. David and Marcus were realizing they'd revealed more than they intended, had given me information that contradicted their earlier statements about Harold being a minor nuisance. "Harold filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office," David said reluctantly. "Claimed we'd defrauded Catherine and violated our fiduciary responsibilities. It was investigated and dismissed. That wasn't what the document showed." According to Harold's filing, the investigation was ongoing when Catherine died, and her death had complicated the case because the primary victim was no longer available to testify. When was it dismissed? Marcus stood up and began packing his briefcase. "Look, Natalie, I can see this conversation is upsetting everyone. Why don't we table this discussion and revisit it when emotions aren't running so high?" He was trying to escape, to end the conversation before more damaging information came out, but I wasn't ready to let them leave with so many questions unanswered. "I'd really like to understand the timeline," I persisted. "When did Harold first make these claims? When was the investigation opened? When was Catherine's diagnosis confirmed?" David stepped between me and Marcus, his body language protective of his brother. "Natalie, you need to drop this line of questioning right now. You're talking about serious allegations against family members, based on nothing but the lies of a criminal. If they're lies, then what's the harm in discussing them?" "The harm is that you're destroying trust in our family over conspiracy theories," David said, his voice low and threatening. "The harm is that you're letting a con artist poison your mind against people who love you." But I noticed he still hadn't answered any of my direct questions. The timeline remained murky, the bank records unexplained, and Harold's specific claims unaddressed. "David, I love you, but I need to understand what really happened to Catherine. These documents raise serious questions, and I can't just pretend they don't exist." David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him making some kind of calculation. When he spoke again, his voice was completely different. Colder, more controlled, and utterly without warmth. "You know what, Natalie? I think you've been spending too much time alone in that attic, letting your imagination run wild. Maybe you should take a break from going through Catherine's things and focus on our life together instead." It was a threat disguised as concern, an attempt to isolate me from the evidence I'd found. But it was also a confirmation that David knew exactly what was in that attic, knew what Catherine had documented, and was terrified of what I might discover. Marcus cleared his throat. "I think I should go. This conversation has gotten off track, and I don't want family relationships damaged over misunderstandings." As he headed toward the door, David followed him, and I could hear them speaking in low voices in the hallway. I couldn't make out the words, but their tones were urgent and worried. When David returned to the living room, his expression was carefully neutral again, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. "Marcus thinks we should consider getting you some professional help," he said. "You're showing signs of paranoia and conspiracy thinking that concern him." The gaslighting was so blatant it was almost comical. David was trying to convince me that seeking answers to legitimate questions was mental illness, that discovering evidence of fraud was paranoid delusion. "David, I'm asking reasonable questions about documents that directly affect our financial future. That's not paranoia. That's due diligence." "Natalie, listen to yourself. You're accusing your own family of elaborate criminal conspiracies based on paperwork filed by an abusive con artist. Does that sound reasonable to you?" I looked at my husband across Catherine's living room and realized that our marriage was over. Not because of Catherine's revelations, or Thomas's evidence, or even David's crimes, but because of this moment when he chose manipulation over honesty, gaslighting over truth. "I think you should leave," I said quietly. David's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing genuine shock underneath. "Leave? This is my house, Natalie. Our house. You can't just kick me out because you're having some kind of breakdown." "This isn't your house, David. This is Catherine's house, and she's not dead." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. David's face went completely white, and for a moment he looked like he might collapse. "What did you just say?" "I said Catherine isn't dead. I found her journals in the attic. I know about Harold. About the abuse. About the money you and Marcus stole from her. I know about the forged documents and the fake inheritance, and your plan to blame me when it all comes out." David sank into the nearest chair, his hands shaking visibly. When he looked up at me, his eyes held a mixture of fear and rage that made my skin crawl. "You don't know what you're talking about," he whispered. "I know everything, David. And tomorrow morning, I'm turning it all over to the district attorney's office." The transformation that came over David's face was terrifying. The man I'd married, the man I'd loved and trusted, disappeared completely, replaced by someone capable of anything. "No," he said, standing up slowly. "You're not." The word hung between us like a blade. David stood in Catherine's living room, his face twisted into an expression I'd never seen before, and I realized I was looking at a stranger who'd been wearing my husband's identity for 8 years. "You're not turning anything over to anyone," he continued, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to forget whatever nonsense you think you found in that attic, and we're going to continue living our life like normal people." I took a step backward, my hand instinctively moving toward my phone. "David, you need to leave now." "I need to leave?" His laugh was harsh and ugly. "This is my house, bought with my inheritance, and you're telling me to leave because you've convinced yourself of some ridiculous conspiracy theory? It's not your house and it's not your inheritance. Catherine is alive, David. She documented everything you and Marcus did to her, and she made sure there would be consequences." David moved closer, his size suddenly seeming threatening in a way it never had before. "Catherine is dead, Natalie. I saw her body. I spoke at her funeral. Whatever you think you found up there is the delusional ramblings of a sick old woman." But his words carried a desperate edge that told me he knew exactly what I'd found. David was trying to convince himself as much as me that Catherine's journals were fiction. "Then you won't mind if I show them to the police," I said, pulling out my phone. David lunged forward and grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You're not calling anyone. You're going to calm down and listen to reason." The physical aggression shocked me more than his threats had. In 8 years together, David had never raised his voice to me, much less put his hands on me. But the man gripping my wrist wasn't the David I'd married. This was the David that Catherine had feared, the one who'd been hidden behind years of careful performance. "Let go of me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not until you promise to stop this insanity. You're my wife, Natalie. Your loyalty should be to me, not to some dead woman's paranoid fantasies." I looked into his eyes and saw something that made my blood freeze. David wasn't just angry or scared. He was calculating, weighing his options, deciding what he was willing to do to keep me quiet. For the first time since I'd known him, I felt genuinely afraid of my husband. "David, you're hurting me." His grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. "I don't want to hurt you. I love you. But I can't let you destroy our family over misunderstandings." Misunderstandings? Catherine was sick, Natalie. Mentally sick as well as physically. The journals you found are the product of a confused mind, full of delusions and false memories. She imagined conspiracies where none existed. David's voice had taken on a soothing quality, the tone someone might use with a frightened child. He was trying a different approach, attempting to convince me that my own perceptions were unreliable. She imagined the forged signatures, the fake bank statements, the payments to Harold. David's face went rigid again. "How do you know about Harold?" The question confirmed everything. David wasn't denying knowledge of Harold anymore, wasn't pretending the abusive relationship was Catherine's delusion. He was asking how much I knew about their collaboration. "I know you and Marcus paid him to keep Catherine isolated and compliant while you stole from her. I know you used her fear of him to manipulate her into signing documents. I know you turned a blind eye to abuse because it served your purposes." David released my wrist and stepped back, his expression cycling through shock, fear, and finally resignation. He sank into Catherine's armchair and buried his face in his hands. "You don't understand," he said, his voice muffled. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." For a moment I saw a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable and lost and struggling with guilt. But I couldn't let sympathy override my need for truth. "Then tell me how it was supposed to happen." David looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Catherine really was being abused. Harold really was controlling her, taking her money, making her afraid to leave the house. When Marcus and I realized what was happening, we tried to help. "By stealing from her yourself?" "By protecting her assets from Harold," David said, his voice gaining strength as he rebuilt his justification. "We moved her money to accounts Harold couldn't access, made sure her property was legally protected, prevented him from bankrupting her completely." I stared at my husband in amazement. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, David was reframing theft as rescue. "David, you didn't move her money to protect it from Harold. You moved it to steal it for yourselves." "That's not true," he said firmly. "Everything we did was to preserve Catherine's legacy for the family. Harold would have taken everything if we hadn't intervened." "So you took everything instead?" David stood up abruptly, his temporary vulnerability replaced by defensive anger. "We didn't take anything that wasn't going to be ours eventually anyway. Catherine had no children, no spouse, no close relationships outside the family. Her money was always going to come to us." The entitlement in his voice was staggering. David genuinely believed he had a right to Catherine's money simply because he was related to her. That stealing from her while she was alive was merely collecting his inheritance early. "That doesn't make it legal, David. Or moral." "Moral?" David's voice rose again. "What's moral about letting a vulnerable old woman be systematically abused while her family stands by and does nothing? What's moral about allowing a predator like Harold to steal everything she worked for her entire life? What's moral about working with Harold to abuse her?" David went very still. "We didn't work with him to abuse her. We used him to get information about her condition and mental state. There's a difference. You paid him money in exchange for helping you manipulate Catherine. That's collaboration." "We paid him to keep us informed about Catherine's welfare," David corrected. "Harold was going to be there regardless of what we did. At least this way, we had some insight into her situation." The rationalization was so complete, so thorough, that I realized David might actually believe his own lies. He'd constructed an elaborate mental framework that transformed every cruel act into noble protection, every theft into family preservation. "David, listen to yourself. You're describing paying Catherine's abuser to help you steal from her, and you're calling it welfare checks. I'm describing a complex family situation that required difficult choices." David shot back. "Choices you're too naive to understand. because you've never had to deal with anything more complicated than choosing what color to paint the living room." The condescension was breathtaking. David was dismissing my intelligence and moral judgment because I'd discovered his crimes and refused to accept his justifications for them. "You're right," I said quietly. "I am naive. I was naive enough to believe that my husband was a good man who would never lie to me or steal from vulnerable family members. I was naive enough to think that love meant honesty and protection, not manipulation and exploitation." David's expression softened slightly. "Natalie, I am a good man. Everything I did was to protect our future together. Catherine was going to die anyway, and Harold was going to take everything. At least this way, her money went to family members who actually cared about her. If you cared about her, you would have helped her escape Harold instead of using him to control her." "We tried to help her," David insisted. "But Catherine was too proud and too ashamed to accept help. She'd rather suffer in silence than admit she'd made mistakes." I thought about Catherine's journals, her detailed documentation of isolation and fear, her desperate attempts to find a way out of an impossible situation. She hadn't been too proud to accept help. She'd been too terrified of the consequences, and too aware that her own family saw her as an asset rather than a person. "Did you know she was planning to fake her death?" David hesitated before answering, and that pause told me everything I needed to know. "Catherine was talking crazy toward the end," he said finally. "She said things about disappearing, about starting over, but we thought it was just the pain medication making her delusional. You knew she was planning to leave Harold, and you did nothing to help her." "We offered to help her leave Harold," David said defensively. "But she refused. Said it would only make things worse, that Harold would never let her go. So you decided to profit from her situation instead." David's jaw clenched. "We decided to make sure Harold didn't profit from her situation. And we succeeded. When Catherine died, Harold got nothing. When Catherine supposedly died." "Catherine is dead, Natalie. I don't care what you think you found in those journals. I saw her body." The hospital confirmed her death. She was buried in Millbrook Cemetery. But his voice lacked conviction, and I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. David was beginning to question his own certainty about Catherine's death. "Then it won't be a problem when I turn the journals over to the police," I said. "If Catherine is really dead, then there's no case to investigate." David stared at me for a long moment, and I watched him make some internal calculation. When he spoke again, his voice was different, colder, and more determined. "You're not turning anything over to the police, because you're not going to find those journals again. And if you try to tell anyone about this conversation, I'll make sure they understand exactly what kind of person you really are." The threat was unmistakable, but it came too late. The recording device in my pocket had captured everything, including David's admissions about collaborating with Harold and his current attempts to intimidate me into silence. "What kind of person am I, David?" "The kind who would destroy her own family over delusions and spite. The kind who would rather see her husband in prison than admit she was wrong about something. The kind who values being right more than love and loyalty." David was trying to rewrite our entire relationship, making me into the villain of a story where he was the misunderstood hero. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and it might have worked if I hadn't spent the last week learning to recognize his techniques. "I think you should leave now," I repeated. "I'm not leaving my house." "It's not your house, David. The mortgage is fraudulent, the ownership documents are forged, and the real owner is still alive somewhere. This house belongs to Catherine, and she made sure you'd never legally own it." David's face went white again. "That's impossible. I have the deed, the will, all the legal paperwork." "You have forgeries that Catherine arranged to be created before she disappeared. She wanted you to believe you'd inherited everything so you wouldn't look too closely at what was really happening with her assets." I pulled out my phone and showed David one of the photographs I'd taken of Catherine's journal entries. His eyes widened as he read her detailed plans for creating false documents and worthless assets. "This can't be real," he whispered. "It's all real, David." Catherine documented everything she did, and she left instructions for exposing your crimes once she was safely away from Harold and from you. David sank back into the chair, his face gray with shock and growing understanding. If this is true, then we're ruined. The house, the loans, the credit cards, everything was based on the inheritance. I know, I've already spoken with a forensic accountant. We're hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt on assets that don't exist. I looked at my husband, this man who dragged me into his fraud without my knowledge or consent, and felt the last traces of love and loyalty drain away. There is no we anymore, David. You forged my signature on loan documents, opened credit accounts in my name, and created a paper trail that makes me look like a co-conspirator in your crimes. You were willing to let me take the blame for everything if you got caught. David's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He'd been so focused on his own legal exposure that he'd forgotten about the evidence he'd created implicating me in his fraud. Natalie, I can explain all of that. I was trying to protect you from having to worry about the details. You were trying to create a scapegoat in case your crimes were discovered. Catherine warned me about it in a letter she left specifically for your wife. Quote, I showed him another photograph, this one of Catherine's letter, predicting exactly how David would try to shift blame onto me. David read it with growing horror, seeing his own behavior predicted with uncanny accuracy. She couldn't have known I'd do that, he said weakly. She knew because you'd been doing it to her for years, using her kindness and trust against her, making her complicit in your crimes, positioning her to take responsibility for your actions. Catherine recognized the pattern because she'd lived through it. David buried his face in his hands again. What do you want from me, Natalie? I want you to leave. Tonight. And I want you to turn yourself in to the district attorney's office before they come looking for you. And if I do that, then maybe you can avoid some of the charges. Maybe you can make a deal by testifying against Marcus and helping them locate Harold. Maybe you can show some remorse for what you did to Catherine and to me. David looked up at me with desperate eyes. What about us? What about our marriage? I thought about the question seriously, trying to find some trace of the man I'd fallen in love with underneath the lies and manipulation and casual cruelty. But that man had been a performance, a role David had played to gain my trust and compliance. Our marriage was built on lies, David. You never loved me. You loved having someone who trusted you completely and never questioned your decisions. You loved having a witness to your good character and a potential fall guy for your crimes. That's not true, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. If it's not true, then why did you forge my signature on legal documents? Why did you create fake emails in my name? Why did you plan to blame me if you got caught? David had no answer for those questions because there was no answer that didn't confirm exactly what I'd accused him of. I need you to leave, I said again. This time, David didn't argue. He stood up slowly, looking around Catherine's living room like he was seeing it for the first time. Where will I go? That's not my problem anymore. David walked toward the door, then turned back to face me. Natalie, I want you to know that I did love you. Maybe not the way I should have, but in the only way I knew how. I looked at this man, who'd shared my life for 8 years, who'd been my best friend and closest confidant, who'd systematically lied to me about everything that mattered. I felt profound sadness for the relationship we'd never really had and the future we'd never really been building together. I believe you loved me as much as you're capable of loving anyone, I said. But that wasn't enough to build a marriage on, and it wasn't enough to stop you from destroying both our lives. After David left, I sat alone in Catherine's house, surrounded by the remnants of her carefully planned revenge and the wreckage of my own shattered illusions. The silence felt different now, not empty, but expectant, as if the house itself was waiting to see what would happen next. I called Thomas Chen, even though it was nearly midnight. It's done, I told him when he answered. I have everything we need. 3 days later, David and Marcus were arrested at their respective homes. The charges included elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Harold was arrested the following week in Florida, where he'd been living under an assumed name while working as a caregiver for another elderly woman. The local news covered the arrests with headlines about family greed and elder abuse that made me grateful I'd kept my maiden name professionally. David's attempts to implicate me in his crimes fell apart when investigators heard the recordings of him admitting to forging my signatures and creating false evidence against me. Linda Rodriguez became my temporary landlord when I moved into her spare bedroom, refusing to accept rent and insisting that helping expose the truth about Catherine's situation was payment enough. We spent long evenings talking about justice and healing, about the courage it takes to rebuild your life after discovering that everything you believed was false. Thomas arranged for me to speak with Catherine by phone 2 weeks after the arrests. Her voice was weak but determined, and she cried when I told her that Harold was in custody and couldn't hurt her anymore. "I never imagined David's wife would be the one to bring them to justice," she said. "I hoped you'd be able to protect yourself, but I never dreamed you'd be strong enough to protect me too." Catherine died peacefully in her sleep 6 weeks later, surrounded by new friends who'd helped her build a final chapter of her life based on truth and dignity rather than fear and manipulation. She left her real assets to domestic violence shelters and elder abuse prevention organizations, but not before ensuring I had enough money to finish my education and start fresh. The house on Maple Street was foreclosed on 3 months after the arrests, sold at auction to pay the fraudulent debts David and Marcus had accumulated. I watched from Linda's front porch as new owners moved into Catherine's carefully preserved home, and I felt grateful that the house would finally shelter people who deserved its beauty and history. David pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and received 8 years in federal prison. Marcus fought the charges but was convicted and sentenced to 12 years. Harold received 15 years for his crimes against Catherine and 3 other elderly women he'd victimized over the past decade. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in helping victims of financial and emotional abuse, learning to recognize the signs of manipulation I'd missed during my marriage. She helped me understand that David's ability to lie convincingly didn't make me naive for believing him, that his skill at manipulation didn't make me weak for being manipulated. 2 years after Catherine's death, I graduated with a master's degree in social work, specializing in elder abuse prevention and victim advocacy. I work now for a nonprofit organization that helps families identify and respond to financial exploitation, using the painful lessons I learned from my own experience to protect others from similar betrayals. Sometimes people ask me if I ever regret exposing David's crimes, if some part of me wishes I'd remained ignorant of the truth and kept my comfortable life. The question always surprises me because the answer is so clear. The comfortable life was an illusion built on other people's suffering. The truth, however painful, gave me the chance to build something real. I never saw David again after that night he left Catherine's house, though I heard he wrote me letters from prison that I chose not to read. Linda told me he'd tried to contact her once, asking if she thought I'd be willing to visit him, but I'd moved on from needing explanations or apologies from someone who demonstrated so clearly that his words couldn't be trusted. Catherine's story became the foundation of my new career, but more than that, it became the foundation of my new understanding of strength and justice. She'd spent 30 years as a victim before finding the courage to save herself, and in doing so, she'd saved me too. The woman who found those journals in the attic was someone who trusted blindly and accepted explanations without question. The woman I became through discovering Catherine's truth was someone who knew that real love requires honesty, that family obligations run both ways, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's cruelty. I kept Catherine's locket, the one with her sister's picture inside, and I wear it as a reminder that the truth, however painful, is always worth pursuing. Because the truth didn't destroy my life, it revealed that the life I thought I was living had been a carefully constructed lie. The truth gave me the chance to build something authentic, something based on my own values and choices rather than someone else's manipulation and greed. In the end, Catherine's final gift wasn't the money she'd left me or even the legal protection she'd arranged. Her final gift was the example of a woman who refused to remain a victim, who found the strength to fight back against people who'd underestimated her, and who made sure that justice would be served even if she didn't live to see it. I think about her often when I'm working with families facing similar situations, helping them navigate the complex emotions of discovering that people they trusted have been exploiting them. I tell them Catherine's story, not for revenge or bitterness, but as proof that it's possible to survive betrayal and build something better from the wreckage. The truth set me free, but more importantly, it gave me the tools to help set others free as well. And in a world where vulnerability is often seen as weakness, that feels like the most powerful legacy Catherine could have left behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.